And I can't just be running off in a panic because there's a room downstairs with a bed and a bucket.
Sometimes the best ideas are rigorously thought out, planned, and considered from every angle and executed precisely as that plan demands. And sometimes you accidentally stumble into an idea, like you were thrown into a dark room and told to randomly, blindly grab at a bunch of stuff. And then you walk out holding gold bars, a copy of Spiderwick the video game, and a perfectly ripe banana. Zach Cregger seemed to manage something along those lines when he wrote Barbarian, a film about a woman who rents an Airbnb only to learn that it's been double booked, with a man already being in the house when she gets there. Cregger set out to write nothing more than one long scene of every red flag he could imagine after reading The Gift of Fear, a book written by Gavin de Becker, which talks about how women should follow their gut feelings and listen to the alarm bells in their heads during social interactions. What started out essentially as a writing exercise for him turned into a feature-length film that subverts the viewer's expectations many, many times, largely because Cregger was setting out to surprise himself with the story, worrying that the direction of that scene he'd been working on would be too predictable, and decided to just throw some wild twists and turns into the mix. That approach to writing can result in a jumbled mess a lot of the time, but Cregger managed to avoid that and came out of that dark room with one of the most tense, surprising, and well-crafted horror films in a year that was stuffed to the brim with some insane offerings. 2022 was a crazy year for horror fans. Barbarian is wild. It feels like every time you have a grasp on the direction it's going, it slaps you in the face and tells you to stop trying to guess and just let the magic happen. And it manages to do that without feeling all that disconnected. It's been 3 years now that I've been getting requests to talk about Barbarian, so let's finally do that. The film opens with Tess, a young woman who's traveled to Detroit for a job interview with a documentary filmmaker, arriving at her Airbnb in the middle of the night. Barbarian will show around the halfway point that it's got a couple of different tones, but this first section of the movie is basically all a slow burn, tension-filled experience, and for me, it's my favorite part of the whole thing. Barbarian deals a lot with assumptions, with Bill Skarsgård's character Keith, Justin Long's AJ, and James Butler's Andre all being character examples of that, but it extends beyond that sort of thing. Expectation and surprise was clearly something that Cregger was thinking about a lot while working on this script, and that bled into the narrative itself in some really cool ways. On top of those characters, you also have these cops later on assuming that Tess is on drugs instead of validating her claims one way or another. Those cops are also part of another thing that this movie is dealing with, but we'll save that for a bit later on. The reason I'm mentioning this now is because of how Barbarian beginning during the night plays into a part of that feeling of never quite knowing what to expect, since when Tess arrives, we only see the house that she's staying at, and then we unconsciously are making assumptions about the sort of place she's in. It looks like a well-kept suburban area, but we'll see the next morning that this is actually an extremely dilapidated neighborhood that is probably really dangerous to be in. The movie isn't just dealing with assumptions and expectations for an excuse to have the audience be surprised by where things go. It's also constantly dealing with how those assumptions can endanger us when we let ourselves get distracted by our first impressions. Sometimes they're correct, sometimes they're not, but often you're better off erring on the side of caution if you want to avoid getting hurt. Barbarian's tone is immediately oppressive, with the dark and rainy night obscuring the danger that we'll only learn later on is there. Essentially, what we're watching through the first act of the film is a suspense thriller, where we're mostly trying to feel out Keith, who's already staying in the house that Tess rented through Airbnb when she arrives there and finds that the key isn't in the lockbox. Whoever's managing the rentals of this place seems kind of oh yeah, right. He is dumb.
Love it!
Bill Skarsgård is an amazing actor. I've never seen him give a bad performance, and I think he was also the perfect casting for this role because he has a very warm demeanor to him that helps make him somewhat trustworthy, but he's also capable of playing really evil characters, as we're all well aware of, and there's a cool level to his performance where his character is a perfectly fine dude, but he also manages to throw these little hints into the performance that could easily be part of someone much worse than he is, and that helps in making him feel rather unpredictable and hard to fully read.
You know what I just realized? Oh, the water's heating up, by the way. You know what I just realized?
This is obviously a really tough situation. It's terrible for her because a woman staying in a house with a man she doesn't know is obviously something that is generally going to be avoided at all costs. She really doesn't have much of a choice here, as there's a local convention going on and there are no vacancies around. And through their interactions, she does get to the point where she trusts him enough to accept a sleeping arrangement of him on the couch and her in the locked bedroom, but it's still not ideal. This awkwardness between them is handled really well early on, and it's also nice to see her taking actual precautions instead of just naively walking into this situation and blindly trusting what he says. It's not just an awkward and stressful situation for Tess though, because while we don't know if Keith's trustworthy or not when the movie begins, he actually winds up being perfectly fine, and you can tell how nervous he is the whole time of making Tess nervous.
I thought you wouldn't want any if you didn't see me open it, so I waited.
He knows what this sort of situation looks like and is clearly doing his best to make Tess as comfortable as possible without coming across as creepy, which he isn't always successful at. He doesn't want to scare her, and in some ways his attempts to seem more trustworthy probably make things even more uneasy, but I'm not sure it would even be possible to navigate this sort of situation without some level of awkwardness. While we can say that with the context of where it goes, what I really love about this section of the film is how good of a job it does of making the movie feel like it's building up to a reveal of him actually being a threat by making use of your expectations within a thriller like this and using them against you. My favorite detail here is in a connection that they make, where Tess is here to potentially get a job with a documentary filmmaker who just so happens to be working on a project for which an interview with Keith would be a golden opportunity.
Because I'm actually one of the founders of the Lion Tamers.
You're kidding.
No.
This is genius. It's the thing that really eases Tess up to him, but it also serves as a way to add this layer of stress for the viewer because it seems so convenient. It creates this lingering feeling that Keith may have known who she was before meeting her and set this whole thing up to lure her into a false sense of security. So when she loosens up after this, it makes it seem like she's falling into a trap. She isn't, but it sure as hell feels like that at this point of the movie, and I really love how Kreger toyed with our expectations and our knowledge of how stories like this play out to create some fantastic misdirection for where the story is heading. He's clearly a filmmaker who understands these kinds of stories, and he used the fact that other people also do against the viewer brilliantly. Because it doesn't feel like someone intentionally trying to misdirect you in their script. It feels like someone who is telling the story you think they are, and you're just so used to this kind of thing that you feel like you're seeing through it. It's really good. Then with scenes like Tess waking up to her door wide open but having Keith dead asleep on the couch when it happens, you start to get this really creepy feeling that there is something else entirely going on here. And it's that wonderful descent into something much deeper than what we know that makes this such an engaging and twisting watch. Once Tess finds the absolute nightmare of a hidden room in the basement and Keith tries to stop her from leaving so he can go see it before piecing out, once again, they do a great job of balancing the fact that he is actually being honest with the fact that we don't know he is yet and that he could entirely still be a very dangerous person. This whole thing could easily be a part of something really dark, where Keith actually owns the property maybe. He rented it out through a different app after seeing that Tess had gone through Airbnb and set this whole thing up to lure her into the basement. Like maybe he has an accomplice in this plan who's gonna grab her as soon as he leaves the room, and then she'll end up trapped down there. It's just this great, deeply unsettling dynamic with this character that Kreger handled really, really well. It's all super tense, and when the movie decides it's time to start cranking up the horror, the slow buildup as Tess goes deeper into hell is honestly one of the most memorable sequences in horror for me in a very long time. I very clearly remember sitting in the theater for this one as she discovered the secret door, found the hidden room at the end, and then especially when she starts making the descent down into the stone tunnels after Keith calls up begging for help. I can remember my heart just beating out of my chest. Like I felt actually dizzy with this phenomenal sense of dread that had been built up through this whole thing. And what made it so much more horrifying was that at this point of the movie, I still didn't really have much of an idea or an idea at all of what was going on. So I was just completely in the dark. This shit was genuinely terrifying on my first viewing, and even now, after a few years, I still found it really effective, and even though I knew there was a jump scare coming when she got down there, it still managed to make me involuntarily react and yell out loud, which is something I never do. I was watching this movie on my own. Do you know how much it takes for a jump scare to make me vocalize while watching a movie by myself. One of my notes for this video during the scene of her going down those stairs just says, "Deep breaths, Evan." So that should give a decent idea of where I was at here. Before we move on too much, I need to talk about the score in Barbarian, because a huge part of why I felt so sickeningly on edge during this whole thing is because of one of the tracks that plays for the soundtrack. Now, I didn't find the score on the whole to be particularly memorable. It's more something that's meant to exist and drone on during these scenes to help create the atmosphere, but it does serve its purpose and is a great backdrop for the slow burn dread through the first chunk of the movie. It's a lot of really dark, droning tracks that are super atmospheric, but the reason I need to really emphasize this is because of one specific part of this that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Literally, if I just think about it. Now, the track I'm talking about isn't actually something that was written for the movie, which I wasn't aware of until I was trying to find it for this video. It's actually a song called Necro by A001 from their Nyctophobia EP. It's used during the sequence of Tess discovering the room with a bed and a bucket, and also during another later on as we meet Richard Brake's character, and it is absolutely horrifying. It sounds like the worst parts of human experience brought to life with one super simple motif, like all of the sickness and nastiness is being bundled up into one awful sound. That whole EP is genuinely terrifying, and it's got an album cover that I feel like I shouldn't look at for more than a few seconds or I'll risk getting cursed by something. So, okay, yeah, good job, A001 Nyctophobia EP. Can you go away now? It's extremely effective at building up this horrifically disturbing feeling, and the ways it's used here took sequences that were already pretty damn stressful and made them some of the most memorable sequences in horror in the last few years for me. Another thing that I really enjoyed through the first section of the film is the point where Tess and Keith both start to get more comfortable with each other. The scene where Keith is showing her how he puts on a duvet is really sweet and funny, and the chemistry between the two of them is a lot of fun.
So graceful.
That's how you do it.
Are you usually this out of breath afterwards?
Especially on subsequent viewings when you know that Keith is being genuine and you can let your guards down, the material here is always really nice and heartfelt. Granted, when you know where things are going, it's also just sad, but you gotta take what you can get, I guess. Speaking of which, Keith's death is brutal as all hell. The movie isn't a constant gore fest by any means, but when it wants to get violent, it gets really violent. With this scene definitely leaving the strongest impact, since up to this point the movie has been a very slow burn and tension-filled experience. Then you're just slapped in the face. Sorry, your head is bashed against a cave wall with this incredibly horrific death that Keith faces, which is a moment that's layered really well because at the same time while we're watching Keith get eviscerated, we're also realizing that he was being honest the whole time and wasn't actually a threat to anyone, so it's disturbing in multiple ways. Now, this is where Barbarian flips the whole thing on the viewer, because up to this point, we've had this crawling, suspenseful film that was really taking its time. It got to a point that is some of the most tense stuff I've seen in a while. It's really unsettling and frankly sickening in what it felt like it was leading to. You had this huge explosion of violence, some crazy, horrifying creature thing is revealed, and then all of a sudden you're thrown for a loop with a massive tonal shift where we suddenly jump to a bright sunny day in California with Justin Long jamming to some upbeat music in a comical way. This was tough for me on my first watch.
When I was a young man, I was led to believe there were organizations that would kill a message for me.
There are plenty of movies I love with these roller coasters of different tones, genre blending, what have you, but I was so into the slow burn thriller that the film had been up to this point, and so shaken by what had happened in the hidden tunnels that when the film suddenly flipped into something completely different, I was frustrated on my first watch. That's an inherent risk you take when you decide to do something like this, especially if you're putting in the amount of care that Kreger was into that first act to make it as good as it was. I got invested in something that the movie basically throws out of the window for the rest of the runtime, and it took me quite a while to come around on where things go. That being said, after 3 years, I have accepted it completely, and what I think makes this tonal shift so great is in the ways that the tone of the first act bleeds into what we see going on here. Not in the sense that what we still feel, but because we know that something that feels as dark as what we saw going on in the tunnels is there. And joining up with a character who's in the bright sun jamming out to some fun tunes on the coast makes him feel incredibly vulnerable to whatever that was, because of how different the world he's currently existing in is, and how we know that these two sections are going to converge at some point. AJ is another part of the film where they play with expectations and assumptions in really interesting ways, and a lot of what makes this work so well is how they took us for a loop with Keith's character, setting him up to seem suspicious and somewhat off-putting without the context of where it was going, only for us to learn that he was a perfectly fine dude the whole time. AJ is the opposite side of that coin, where he is accused of a woman while on set of a pilot they were shooting for a TV show, and while last time it turned out that the suspect was chill as hell, that's definitely not the case this time. I think there's a certain level where they're trying to make you question whether or not AJ is actually guilty or not, but he does have a general vibe to him that makes it more clear that he probably did do it, and we get the confirmation of this when his friend asks him about it later on.
Like, I mean, was she like, did she say no?
I mean,
like, no, stop?
At first, but like...
Justin Long is always entertaining and does these horror comedy roles very well, but holy shit, this character is insufferable.
What up, Guess who's back in town?
The first huge red flag is that the very first thing he asks when he learns of the accusations is whether or not the show is still happening.
Wait. What about the pilot? Hold on. Wait a minute. This is crazy. So are we not picked up anymore?
He is a self-centered, self-pitying dipshit who's constantly making excuses for his horrible behavior, and it got to a point where I was just giddy with excitement waiting for him to go down into the tunnels for himself. I was filled with fear when Tess was doing it, and every part of me wished she would just turn around, but here I am just grinning. That being said, because that first chunk is so effectively scary, it still makes it so that while I would love for AJ to go down there, I'm still on edge at the thought of getting back into the tunnels myself. So while we watch this character who is so distracted by the situation he's dealing with at the moment, and also by the realization that the rental property he owns appears to have a hell of a lot more square footage that he had in the listing, it's extremely uneasy because of the fact that we know that the tone of the movie is just hiding something truly horrifying that we're sure to meet again very soon. He's come to Detroit to liquidate some of his rental properties to help pay for the immense legal battle he's preparing to face, and also for the inevitable drying up of his income since the woman who's accusing him of has a big story coming out about it the next day. Before the news is even public, he's being told that he's almost certainly lost the job on the show. His financial planner is cutting ties with him right after informing him that he's basically financially fucked. He put himself in the situation, of course, but I do like how the movie uses this extremely stressful point for AJ to just blindside him with the thing waiting for him in the rental property that he owns. AJ isn't just a piece of shit for what he did, but there's a lot just in the nature of his character setup that helps in making him horrible, with that rental property being a big one. We know that this is an area that was once a healthy suburban neighborhood, but it's been completely left behind now. The cops don't really pay attention when people here call for help, which is something I'll get into in a little bit, and it's just derelict, entirely left to rot away, and for this rich dude to buy up one of the properties here and keep it well maintained and use it for a rental is pretty damn disgusting. There's no doubt in my mind that he chose this one because the land was very cheap to purchase considering the area, and it's really just a huge slap in the face to these struggling people who do reside in the area to see this one nice house that's being occupied probably by a lot of well-off business people who are in town for meetings like Tess and Keith were. It's gross to see him taking advantage of a place like this, and propping up something like that just undoubtedly makes life worse for people around here. One thing that I absolutely loved about how they handled his character was that towards the end, he does actually have a moment where he seems to genuinely feel guilty about what happened. There are a couple of moments where it feels more honest, like perhaps he does actually accept that he did something wrong and wishes he could fix it or go back and change things. But no, as we've already established, AJ is a completely irredeemable piece of shit, and this scene illustrates that perfectly. Something that I really like about Barbarian is that how it doesn't always directly explore a character trait, but instead uses something else in the movie as a way to plant a certain idea or theme in your head, which can then be applied to something else entirely. The contrast between Keith and AJ's character is a really great one, but it's here where AJ has that moment where he breaks down crying about what happened, where I think Krager did the best job with that sort of thing. A big part of that speech is him just wanting to be better in the future, to not hurt people as much, and to not be selfish.
I can't change what I've done. I can just try and fix it.
When the mother, who I'll talk more about in a second, is closing in on Tess and AJ on top of a water tower, AJ says fuck all that noise and tosses Tess off the edge of the tower as a distraction for the mother because she's very connected with Tess. And for the cherry on top, he starts clamoring about how there was nothing he could have done and that he's going to save her now. The dude immediately goes to blaming her, saying that she slipped, saying it wasn't his fault, and that paints a very clear picture of who he is through and through.
I didn't even let go. You started to slip. There's nothing I could do.
Every time the dude claimed to have been innocent of his accusations, said he felt bad, cried about wanting to be a better person, it was all pure, concentrated bullshit. He is a selfish piece of shit who is absolutely guilty and will only ever apologize or express anything resembling remorse once it comes back to bite him in the ass or he doesn't need to risk himself in any way to do the right thing. There's this great contrast between him and Tess, because earlier in the movie, she refused to leave him alone in the tunnels. She went to the cops to try and get help and even went back down in there to save him. She put herself in extreme danger because she was not going to leave him down there to die. And he shoved her off a water tower to try and keep himself alive and then said that she slipped. He truly sucks. I also like how they set this up earlier on when he accidentally shoots Tess in the tunnels thinking that it's the mother, because it's a situation where he was trying to defend himself and did actually make a mistake, which is a great way for them to tee up that ball for him to hit off at the final scene. I also think it's important to mention that while I don't think the movie ever reaches the frightening heights of that first act, it doesn't entirely lose the horror when the comedy comes into play. When AJ gets down into the tunnels in particular, there's some really great stuff, with my favorite moment being this one where his flashlight is flickering and we get this super creepy look at the mother as she approaches him in the darkness. There's a cool little detail here that shows how accustomed to this environment she is, where you can see her feeling along the walls, which indicates that she's memorized the whole thing down here and can navigate entirely in darkness, which really cranks up the tension when people are trying to get around here at what's a severe disadvantage. Once again, right as the fear factor of this section is reaching its height, we're immediately ripped from what we were just watching to being introduced to yet another entirely new string of this story. Barbarian, for all it does wonderfully well, can feel a little jarring because of this sort of thing, and doing it twice is something that I can absolutely see leaving a bad taste in someone's mouth, like mine in 2022. That being said, each time they do this, it feels like we're getting deeper into the darkness of what's happening here. As the last time we had this cut, the tone of where we went was very light and humorous, and that's not the case here. This is where what felt like conflicting tones before comes together in a really cool way, with Richard Brake's character Frank preparing to go get some groceries. As soon as we jump to him, there's something very off-putting about it. At this point of the film, it's become pretty clear that we can never trust how things look at face value. So the guards are already up when we see this brightly lit, vibrant, and colorful visual tone in this glowingly alive suburban neighborhood. The look here doesn't even remotely reflect how it actually feels, though, which is thanks to a couple of things. One of them is just how we've been conditioned by what's happened in the movie so far, but there are also some cool stylistic decisions that help to make this feel very uneasy before we even know why. The neighborhood looks nice, but it feels very empty and barren, like one of those liminal space images that I've spent way too much time looking at. Then there's the shift to a very wide-angle lens that follows Frank, making us feel locked into his perspective, which helps build up this sense that whatever has been going on up to this point, he's been the one at the root of it all, as it's the first time this sort of thing has happened. We also get the shift in the aspect ratio to something much more square, which helps to emphasize that sense of perspective while also making things feel really claustrophobic, like you're trapped in the tunnels before they've even been formed. And all of this combined just creates this great it's a really uncomfortable feeling. Is that great? Maybe. That's up to you fucking freaks. We hear on the radio that the country is currently battling with the worst economy in 50 years, and we also see one of Frank's neighbors letting him know that he and his family are moving away.
But the wife thinks if we don't do it now, we may not be able to get out this time next year, because, you know, the neighborhood's going to hell, Frank.
I love how they pace this section of the story as we watch Frank shopping for baby stuff, since at this point we don't know anything about him, aside from the fact that he's played by Richard Brake, which I think is a fantastic decision because I don't know if I've ever seen him in a role where he's not fucked up in one way or another. It's like as soon as you see him, you're like, oh God, what is he gonna do? It's not until we see him stalking a woman and following her to her house that the uneasy feeling takes off its cloak and reveals itself as a real fear. And I loved how they brought back that horrifying music from when Tess was first going down here to lead into this sequence of Frank tricking this woman into thinking he's a maintenance worker so that he can unlock her window. It's a cool way to tie things together and help illustrate that what we're watching unfold here is the beginnings of what Tess found in the basement. This is the shortest section of the movie, very simply showing that really chilling sequence of him before closing off with him returning home and opening the basement door to the sound of a screaming woman. So basically what's been going on is that Frank was kidnapping women, bringing them to this horrible dungeon, having children with them, and then presumably having children with the children? Which is how we wound up with that monstrosity. AJ may be a bad dude, but he may as well be Keanu Reeves next to Frank. So, what of the mother? Well, she murdered Keith, kidnapped Tess and AJ, and has been hunting them down, so surely she's pure evil, right? Well, no. She's the result of severe inbreeding and clearly wanted to have a mother role for herself, so she basically just wanted to bring Tess and AJ under her wing as children. It's like, it's adoption. It's sweet. She's a nice lady. I like her. Frank is still alive down here as well, but, well, not for long after AJ finds him down there.
No, wait!
I love how well Richard Brake plays this absolutely derelict version of the character who is basically just a skeleton with a layer of latex on at this point. The idea of him not having seen sunlight and being trapped down here for decades is definitely reflected in how he looks. One other thing I wanted to touch on is the absolutely insane scene of watching how the cops deal with Tess finally escaping and going to search for help so she can save AJ. Now, it's true that if you just look at her, it's not a far cry to assume that she may not be in her right mind, but it's the utter disregard of this whole thing that makes it feel so unsettling. It's a good piece of social commentary with the crime having gotten so bad in the area that the cops just basically don't care anymore, which only makes the state of things worse. It's utter neglect of a place that is only going to get worse through that neglect, and by having Tess look like someone who's just been living outside and taking drugs for weeks, it shows how unwilling these cops are to actually help people who need it. Even if they were right about her being drugged out of her mind and talking nonsense here, to leave someone like that on their own in a place like this just exemplifies the whole problem, especially when she straight up admits to having broken a window. That means that in their minds, there's someone running around on drugs here and smashing windows of properties they don't own. And they're basically just like, stop it, go away and stop. Fucking bring her somewhere, man. Now, one other character I haven't mentioned yet is Andre, a homeless man who we first see very early on in the movie, but whom we believe at first to be a threat. It's a really unsettling introduction to him to have him running at Tess out of focus in the background, but while it at first seemed like he was trying to attack her and wanted her to come out of the house so that he could do some bad shit, he was actually just trying to warn her about the bad shit that he knew was hiding in there. The mother is a sort of local legend who he's well aware of, so he just didn't want her getting hurt. The dude turns out to be a Keith and not an AJ, and he actually gives Tess and AJ a spot to hide out for a little bit, at least before he's unfortunately killed off by the mother when she comes looking. I always feel really bad for the dude. He's not in the movie for long, but James Butler's performance makes him a really sympathetic character in that short time. He just wants to get by and is trying to help people, and he winds up getting killed for it. The movie ultimately comes to a close after Tess, whoopsie daisy, slipped off the water tower. Oh my god. AJ finally gets his comeuppance with the mother splitting his head open, which is brought to life with a great effect and some wonderfully squelchy sound design. You all know how much I love squelch. And Tess winds up taking out the mother and being able to walk free. It's cool how by the end they do manage to add this level of sympathy to something that is so frightening at first, but it's also something I'm glad happened because Tess really deserved to get out of this. Barbarian is awesome. It didn't fully work for me on my first go around because I found the tonal shifts too jarring, and at times I was disappointed because of what I had gotten invested in, but now that I'm well acquainted with it, I can appreciate it a lot more than I could at first. It's extremely creative, it's full of twists and turns that you wouldn't expect, it's a very layered script, it plays with your expectations and impressions in really great ways throughout, it's funny when it wants to be, absurd when it needs to be, and genuinely terrifying when it really lets that suspense crank up. That being said, it's not perfect. I do think that the crazy detail present in the first act is lost in a lot of ways for the rest of the movie, and the third act, honestly, isn't all that great. It's serviceable, but because of the fragmented approach to the storytelling here, it doesn't feel like we're really reaching the climax of all of these bits coming together in a way that feels all that satisfying. Which is part of why I'm so excited to talk about Weapons eventually, because that feels like a much more successful attempt at this sort of storytelling, and it's probably my favorite horror movie of 2025 at this point. It is a crime, by the way, that this still doesn't have a Blu-ray release, which I mean, it has to happen eventually. I mean, Barbarian is something that belongs on the shelf of any horror collector. Come on. Hush was the same thing, was on streaming exclusively forever. Hush got a Blu-ray release, sold super well. Fucking put Barbarian on Blu-ray, dude. Anyway, I like it. I hope that was worth waiting 3 years to hear. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.